If your container garden has been underperforming this year and you can't figure out why, the problem might not be your soil, your sunlight, or even your watering schedule. It might be who you planted next to who. Some vegetable pairings look perfectly natural together in a pot, but underneath the surface, they're quietly sabotaging each other. Stick around, because pairing number one on this list is one almost every beginner makes without realizing it. Container gardening is one of the most rewarding ways to grow your own food, especially if you're working with a patio, balcony, or a small backyard. But containers come with a catch that in-ground gardens don't have to deal with nearly as much: limited space. When two plants share a pot, they're also sharing a finite amount of soil, water, and nutrients. There's no room for roots to spread out and find their own territory the way they would in an open garden bed. That means the wrong combination doesn't just underperform a little. It can lead to stunted growth, smaller harvests, increased disease pressure, and pest problems that spread from one plant to the other in a matter of days. The good news is that once you understand why certain pairings cause trouble, you'll be able to look at any two vegetables and make a smart call about whether they belong in the same container. Before we dive in, if you're new here, this channel is all about practical, no-nonsense gardening advice. So hit subscribe now so you don't lose this video in your feed later. All right, let's get into it, starting with number 10. 10. Tomatoes plus potatoes. Tomatoes and potatoes seem like an obvious match. They're both warm season staples, they're both incredibly popular with home gardeners, and botanically speaking, they're actually close relatives. Both belong to the nightshade family, which is exactly why so many gardeners assume they'll grow well side by side. But that close relation is precisely the problem. Tomatoes and potatoes are vulnerable to many of the same diseases, including early blight and late blight, the same fungal disease responsible for the Irish potato famine. When you grow them in the same container, you're creating a situation where a disease affecting one plant has a very short distance to travel before it infects the other. In the confined, often more humid environment of a container, fungal spores can spread even faster than they would in an open garden. This is a shared disease problem, plain and simple. If you want to grow both, keep them in completely separate containers and consider rotating your growing medium each season, since some blight spores can linger in soil. That relatedness problem doesn't stop with potatoes, though. It shows up again further down this list, so keep it in mind. 9. Beans plus onions. Beans and onions are a common pairing in small kitchen gardens because people like grouping their vegetables by how they'll use them in cooking. It feels efficient, but there's a chemical reason this pairing underperforms. Onions, along with garlic and other members of the allium family, release natural sulfur compounds into the soil as they grow. These compounds have been shown to suppress the growth of legumes like beans and peas. Beans rely on a partnership with soil bacteria to fix nitrogen at their roots, and that process can be disrupted when alliums are growing in close proximity, especially in the tight quarters of a shared container. This falls into the category of natural growth-inhibiting chemicals. It's not a pest or a disease. It's simply a case of one plant releasing compounds that interfere with the biological process another plant depends on. If you're growing beans in containers, give them their own pot, away from onions, garlic, shallots, or leeks. Speaking of plants that release compounds harmful to their neighbors, our next pairing takes that idea even further. 8. Carrots plus mature dill. Carrots and dill are a pairing that actually works well when the dill is young. That's part of what makes this one tricky. Many gardeners plant them together with good intentions and see fine results early in the season, so they assume it's a safe long-term combination. The trouble starts once the dill matures and begins to flower. At that stage, dill starts competing aggressively for the same nutrients carrots need, and it also releases certain compounds into the soil that can inhibit the growth of nearby root vegetables, including carrots. In a container, where root systems are already competing for a small volume of soil, this effect becomes much more pronounced. Your carrots may end up small, forked, or slow to develop. This is a combination of nutrient competition and growth-inhibiting chemicals, and the timing matters. If you want dill in a container, harvest it while it's young, well before it flowers, and don't let it grow to full maturity alongside root vegetables. Root competition is actually going to be the theme of several pairings coming up, starting with this next one. 7. Cucumbers, potatoes. Cucumbers and potatoes get paired together because they're both heavy producers that gardeners want to grow as much of as possible. The logic is simple. If you've only got a few containers, why not maximize your harvest by combining two productive plants? Unfortunately, this pairing runs into two separate problems. First, potatoes are famously heavy feeders, drawing large amounts of nutrients from the soil to fuel their tuber development underground. Cucumbers are also demanding, particularly when it comes to potassium and consistent moisture. In a container, there simply isn't enough soil volume to satisfy both appetites, and one or both plants will come up short. Second, potatoes require periodic hilling, meaning you add soil around the base of the plant as it grows to encourage more tuber formation and protect developing potatoes from sunlight. This process disturbs the soil significantly, which is disruptive to cucumber roots growing nearby. Cucumbers also tend to be susceptible to some of the same fungal issues that affect potato foliage in damp, crowded conditions. This is primarily a nutrient competition issue, compounded by conflicting growing requirements. If you're growing potatoes in a container, they deserve that container to themselves. Speaking of plants with very different growing needs, let's look at a pairing where the mismatch is less about the soil and more about what's happening above ground. 6. Peppers plus fennel. Peppers and fennel might end up in the same container simply because a gardener is trying to fit as many different vegetables and herbs as possible into a limited number of pots. Fennel has a lovely feathery appearance that seems like it would complement almost anything. The issue is that fennel is something of a loner in the plant world. It produces allelopathic compounds, meaning chemicals that inhibit the growth of many other plants nearby, and peppers are particularly sensitive to this effect. Fennel's extensive root system also spreads out and competes aggressively for water and nutrients, which becomes a much bigger issue in the confined space of a container than it would be in open ground. Peppers, meanwhile, need warm, stable conditions and don't compete well against a more dominant root system. The combination results in slower growth and reduced fruit production for the pepper plant. This is a case of growth-inhibiting chemicals combined with root competition. Fennel, as a general rule, tends to do better in its own dedicated container, regardless of what you're trying to pair it with, which is a pattern that's going to come up again before we're done. We're halfway through the list now, and if any of these have already made you rethink a container sitting on your patio right now, drop a comment and let me know which one. I read every single one, and it genuinely helps me figure out what to cover next. Now let's move into the top 5, starting with a pairing that involves two of the most popular container vegetables in North America. 5. Tomatoes plus corn. Tomatoes and corn often end up together simply because they're both classic summer garden vegetables, and gardeners like the idea of a productive, vegetable-filled container bursting with warm season crops. The problem here comes down to a shared pest. Both tomatoes and corn are highly attractive to the corn earworm, which, despite its name, is just as happy feeding on tomato fruit as it is on corn kernels. When you grow these two plants close together, you're essentially creating a buffet that draws this pest in and gives it easy access to both crops. Once established, an infestation can move back and forth between the two plants throughout the growing season. On top of the pest issue, corn grows tall and develops an extensive root system that competes heavily for nutrients and water, something a container simply can't provide enough of for two demanding plants at once. This is a combination of shared pests and root competition. If you love growing both, keep them in separate containers spaced apart and monitor closely for any signs of earworm activity on either plant. Our next pairing takes the potato problem we saw earlier and applies it to a completely different vegetable. 4. Squash, or zucchini plus potatoes. Squash and zucchini are sprawling, generous producers, and many gardeners try to pair them with potatoes because both are seen as reliable, high-yield crops worth the container space. But squash and zucchini have extensive, shallow root systems that spread wide in search of water and nutrients. Potatoes, as we discussed earlier, are heavy feeders with their own significant nutrient demands, plus that hilling process that disturbs the surrounding soil. In a container, these two competing root systems end up fighting for the exact same limited resources at the exact same soil depth, and neither plant gets what it needs to thrive. There's also a humidity concern. Squash and zucchini have large leaves that can create a canopy over the soil, trapping moisture. Combined with the disturbed soil from potato hilling, this creates conditions that favor fungal disease, including the same blight-related issues that affect potatoes generally. This is largely a root competition and nutrient competition issue, with some added disease risk from moisture buildup. If you're growing squash in a container, it needs generous, dedicated space of its own, ideally in a large container by itself. Our next pairing is essentially the same story, with a different vegetable in the starring role. 3. Eggplants plus potatoes. Eggplants and potatoes end up together for a familiar reason. They're both warm-season vegetables that gardeners want to grow in limited container space, and like tomatoes, eggplants are also part of the nightshade family. That shared nightshade lineage means eggplants and potatoes are vulnerable to many of the same diseases and pests, including certain types of blight and the Colorado potato beetle, which will happily move from one nightshade to another if given the chance. In a shared container, that beetle doesn't need to travel far at all. Add to this the fact that potatoes are heavy feeders requiring their own generous nutrient supply, and eggplants also need consistent, substantial feeding to produce well, and you end up with two demanding plants competing in a space that can't support either one properly. This is a combination of shared pests, shared diseases, and nutrient competition. As with tomatoes, potatoes really do need to be the sole occupant of their container. We're closing in on the top two now, and this next one might surprise you if you've ever used this popular herb in a mixed container. 2. Mint plus almost any vegetable. Mint deserves its own category on this list, because the problem isn't really about a specific vegetable pairing, it's about mint itself. Gardeners often add mint to a container because it's useful in the kitchen, smells wonderful, and seems like a harmless herb to tuck in alongside vegetables. The issue is that mint spreads through underground runners called rhizomes, and it does so aggressively. In open ground, mint is notorious for taking over entire garden beds if left unchecked. In the confined space of a container, that aggressive spreading becomes even more of a problem, because there's nowhere for the roots to go, except directly into competition with whatever else is planted there. Mint will steadily claim more and more of the available soil, crowding out the root systems of nearby vegetables and pulling water and nutrients away from them. This is fundamentally an overcrowding and root competition issue, driven by mint's naturally invasive growth habit. If you want to grow mint, it should always be in its own container, with no exceptions, regardless of what vegetable you might be tempted to pair it with. Quick pause before the number one pairing, because I have a feeling a lot of you are guilty of this next one. If you know someone who grows tomatoes in containers, this next part is worth sending their way, so keep that share button in mind. And now, the pairing that takes the top spot on this list. 1. Tomatoes plus fennel. Tomatoes and fennel take the number one spot because this pairing combines two separate problems we've already touched on individually, and together they make for the most damaging combination on this entire list. Fennel, as mentioned earlier, produces allelopathic compounds that inhibit the growth of many neighboring plants, and tomatoes are especially sensitive to these compounds. Research and long-standing gardening observation both point to fennel measurably stunting tomato growth and reducing fruit production when the two are planted close together. On top of that chemical interference, fennel's deep taproot and tomatoes' wide-spreading root system end up competing directly for water and nutrients within the same limited container space. This is a combination of growth-inhibiting chemicals and root competition, and it's severe enough that most experienced gardeners treat it as a firm rule rather than a suggestion. Fennel should really never share a container with tomatoes, and honestly, it does best on its own regardless of what else you're growing. So there you have it, 10 vegetable pairings that might look convenient in a container, but can quietly work against you all season long. Whether the problem comes down to shared diseases, shared pests,
it's a complete
nutrient competition, root competition, mismatched growing requirements, overcrowding, or natural growth-inhibiting chemicals, the underlying lesson is the same. In a container garden, space is precious, and every plant you add needs to earn its place without dragging its neighbors down. Before you plan out your containers this season, take a moment to think about what you're pairing together and why. A little planning now can save you a disappointing harvest later. If this video helped you rethink your container garden setup, give it a like. It genuinely helps this channel grow. Share it with a fellow gardener who could use the heads up. Drop a comment letting me know which pairing surprised you the most. And if you haven't already, subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next video, where we'll dig into more practical, no-nonsense gardening advice you can actually use.